rules are absolute, Eldon Warwick barked, his voice slicing through the glass-walled dining room of his Silicon Valley mansion. The billionaire's empire thrived on ruthless efficiency, his wealth a stark contrast to Zora Hines, his African-American maid from Oakland, now late for the third time. "You're fired, Zora," he roared, slamming his coffee mug down, shattering the morning's calm. Thane, his 9-year-old son, clutched Zora's bottle-cap rocket, screaming, "Dad, no, she's my friend!" Zora, eyes weary but proud, left silently. A flicker of doubt stirred Eldon. Why had she faltered? He tailed her in his Tesla, chasing answers through Oakland's grim streets. What secret hid behind her silence? Could it unravel his world? One truth would change everything. The Tesla's hum was a low growl as Eldon Warwick sped through Silicon Valley's pristine avenues, the morning fog curling like a ghost over the San Francisco Bay. His mansion's glass spires faded in the rear view, their sterile gleam a world apart from the mystery now pulling him toward Oakland. Zora Hines's figure, small but resolute, vanished around a corner, her worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Eldon's pulse thrummed, a mix of suspicion and something sharper. Guilt, perhaps, though he'd never admit it. Her silence as she left, her unyielding dignity despite his verdict, had cracked his certainty. Thane's sobs still echoed in his ears, raw and piercing, a boy's heart breaking over a maid. Why? The question burned, driving him deeper into the chase. Oakland's edges emerged, where Silicon Valley's polish gave way to cracked sidewalks and faded murals. The Bay Area's wealth dissolved into gritty reality. Boarded-up shops, flickering streetlights, and the distant wail of a siren cutting through the dawn. Eldon slowed, his Tesla out of place among rusted cars and overflowing bins. Zora walked on, her steps steady but heavy, as if each carried a weight he couldn't see. She didn't glance back, didn't falter, even as the streets grew rougher. Eldon's fingers tightened on the wheel. Was she hiding something? A secret life? His mind, wired for logic, spun theories. Laziness, deceit, or worse. Yet her weary eyes haunted him, whispering truths he wasn't ready to hear. He parked a block away, the Tesla's sleek frame half hidden behind a dented van. Zora crossed a street littered with broken glass, her thin jacket no match for the chill. A group of men lounged at a corner, their eyes tracking her with lazy menace. Eldon's breath hitched. Danger? He leaned forward, torn between staying hidden and stepping in. Zora's pace didn't waver. She sidestepped a shattered bottle, her head high, and the men let her pass, their laughter fading into the fog. Eldon exhaled, his suspicion warring with unease. This wasn't the Zora he judged, a careless employee breaking his rules. This was a woman carrying a burden, one he dismissed without question. The streets grew narrower, the air thick with the scent of damp asphalt and stale smoke. Zora's path led past a shuttered diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly, and into a maze of crumbling apartment blocks. Eldon followed, his car creeping along, the hum of its engine a whisper in the quiet. She stopped to rub her hands, her breath clouding in the cold, then pressed on, her silhouette fading into the gray dawn. Eldon's mind raced. Why walk? No bus, no car? Poverty, pride, or something else? He'd built algorithms to predict markets, but Zora was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Her reliability had been his anchor for 3 years, yet he'd cast her out without a second thought. Thane's voice rang in his memory. "She's my friend." The boy's desperation, clutching that bottle-cap rocket Zora had made, wasn't childish. It was fierce, protective. Eldon's chest tightened. He'd seen Thane's science projects, littered with Zora's patient handwriting, heard her soft stories of stars during late-night tantrums. She'd given his son something he hadn't: time, care, a spark of wonder, and he'd repaid her with a slammed mug and a cold dismissal. The thought stung, but he pushed it down, focusing on Zora's distant figure. He needed facts, not feelings. She turned down an alley, its walls scrawled with graffiti, and Eldon's pulse quickened. He parked, slipping out of the car, his polished shoes crunching on gravel. The air felt heavier here, the city's pulse raw and unsteady. Zora approached a sagging house, its paint peeling like old skin. She glanced around, then slipped inside, the door creaking shut. Eldon crept closer, his heart pounding, and crouched by a window with crooked blinds. Inside, Zora knelt by an elderly man in a wheelchair, his hands trembling as she spooned oatmeal into his mouth. "Papa, I'm here," she whispered, her voice soft but strained. A pill bottle sat on a cluttered table, its label stark, prescription medicine nearly empty. Eldon's breath caught. Zora wasn't hiding deceit, she was hiding sacrifice. Her lateness, her weary eyes. It wasn't laziness, but a battle fought in silence. She'd walked miles, likely all night, to care for this frail man, saving every cent for his medicine. Eldon's mind flashed to his own verdict. "You're fired." The words tasted bitter now, each one a misstep. He judged her through his lens of control, blind to her truth. His hands clenched, shame creeping in like a virus. He backed away, the window's dim light burning into his memory. Zora's quiet strength exposed his arrogance, and he wasn't ready to face it. He slid back into the Tesla, the leather seat cold against his skin. The chase had answered one question, but raised a dozen more. Why hadn't she explained? Pride, fear, and why did Thane love her so fiercely? Eldon's world, built on certainty, wobbled. He needed to know more, not just about Zora's struggle, but about the woman he'd so easily discarded. As the fog thickened, he vowed to follow her again, to see the life she hid. Something told him the truth wasn't done with him yet. The Tesla's engine fell silent, but Eldon Warwick's heart pounded like a drum in his chest. The image of Zora Hines kneeling beside her frail father, searing his mind. Back in his Silicon Valley mansion, the glass walls seemed to mock him, reflecting a man who'd built an empire on control, but misjudged a woman's quiet strength. Zora's weary eyes, her whispered, "Papa, I'm here," haunted him, each syllable a rebuke to his hasty verdict. He'd called her careless, but she was carrying a burden heavier than he'd ever known. Shame coiled in his gut, a foreign ache for a man who thrived on certainty. He stood in the dining room where he'd fired her, the shattered pieces of Thane's bottle-cap rocket still scattered on the floor, a silent accusation. Thane's sobs had quieted, but the boy's absence weighed on the house. Eldon climbed the spiral staircase, his polished shoes clicking on marble, each step echoing the hollowness he felt. Thane's door was ajar, the room dim save for a sliver of light from his bedside lamp. The boy lay curled on his bed, clutching the bottle-cap rocket Zora had made, its jagged edges pressing into his small hands. "She didn't do anything wrong," Thane whispered, his voice raw, not looking up. Eldon froze in the doorway, his throat tight. He wanted to speak, to offer some explanation, but the words stuck like gravel. Thane's pain was a mirror, reflecting Eldon's own failure. Not as a mogul, but as a father who dismissed what his son cherished. Maris appeared behind him, her silhouette sharp against the hallway's glow. "He hasn't eaten," she said, her voice low but laced with reproach. "He hasn't stopped crying since she left." Her eyes, usually soft, bore into Eldon with a fire he rarely saw. "You didn't even ask why she was late, Eldon. You just judged her." The accusation landed like a blow, each word slicing deeper than the last. Eldon's instinct was to defend himself. Rules were his foundation, the scaffolding of his success. But the memory of Zora's sacrifice, her hands gently feeding her father, crumbled his defenses. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely audible, a confession to himself as much as to Maris. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't want to know. Zora wasn't just a maid to Thane. She was his confidant, his safe place. And you took that away." Maris's words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of truth, each one a pebble in the growing pile of Eldon's guilt. He thought of Thane's science projects, scribbled with Zora's patient notes, her soft voice calming his nightmares. She'd given his son a warmth Eldon never had, a gift he'd repaid with a slammed mug and a cold dismissal. His chest tightened, the air in the mansion suddenly too thin. He turned away, unable to meet Maris's eyes, and retreated to his study, the glass walls closing in like a cage. Alone, Eldon sank into his leather chair, the hum of his empire's servers a distant pulse. He stared at a photo on his desk. Thane, beaming, holding up a science fair ribbon, Zora's arm around him. The memory felt like a betrayal. He'd seen her as a function, a replaceable part in his machine, but she'd been the heart of his home. Her lateness, those minutes he'd condemned, was the cost of her father's survival. Each step through Oakland's grim streets a testament to her love. Eldon's fingers traced the photo, his mind replaying the morning's chaos. Thane's scream, "She's my friend," wasn't childish. It was fierce, a boy protecting the one person who saw him. Eldon's rules had blinded him to that bond, and now his son's pain was his punishment. He stood pacing the study, his polished shoes scuffing the hardwood. The image of Zora's father, frail and trembling, refused to fade. Eldon had built algorithms to predict markets, but he'd failed to predict her. Why hadn't she explained? Pride? Fear of his judgment? He recalled her silence as she left, her head high despite his words. It wasn't defiance, it was strength, the kind he'd never had to muster. His wealth shielded him from struggle, but Zora faced it daily, alone, in a world that offered no mercy. The thought twisted in him, a knot of regret and awe. He'd called her a failure, but she was more resilient than he'd ever be. Maris knocked softly, breaking his spiral. "Thane's asleep," she said, her voice softer now, but her eyes still held that fire. "He asked for Zora, even in his dreams." Eldon nodded, unable to speak. Maris lingered, her hand on the doorframe. "You saw something out there, didn't you?" she asked, her tone probing. Eldon's jaw tightened, the truth too raw to share. "She's not what I thought," he admitted, his voice low. Maris's expression softened, but only slightly. "Then fix it, Eldon, before it's too late." She left, her words hanging like a challenge. Eldon sank back into his chair, the photo of Thane and Zora staring back. He'd followed her to Oakland, seen her truth, but it wasn't enough. Her sacrifice exposed his blindness, but questions still burned. Why had she hidden her struggle? What else was she carrying? The mansion's silence pressed against him, Thane's sobs echoing in his mind. He couldn't undo the firing, but he could learn more. Zora's life, her strength, demanded it. As night fell over Silicon Valley, Eldon vowed to watch her again, to understand the woman he'd wronged. The truth he'd glimpsed was only the beginning, and it was already reshaping him. The Silicon Valley mansion loomed like a crystal cage, its glass walls trapping the echoes of Thane's grief and Eldon Warwick's guilt. Eldon stood in his study, the photo of Thane and Zora Hines staring back, her smile a quiet indictment of his cruelty. The memory of her kneeling by her frail father in that crumbling Oakland house clawed at him, each detail a shard in his conscience. He'd built his empire on precision, but his snap judgment had shattered something irreplaceable. Thane's sobs, Maris's piercing words, "Fix it, Eldon," rang in his ears, a chorus of his failures. He'd seen Zora's truth, but it only deepened the ache. How could he face his son, knowing he'd torn away the one person who made him feel seen? Morning light sliced through the mansion, cold and unyielding. Eldon wandered to the dining room, where the remnants of Thane's bottle-cap rocket lay scattered, a wreckage of his son's trust. He knelt, gathering the pieces, their jagged edges pricking his fingers. Each fragment was a memory of Zora, her patient hands guiding Thane's science projects, her soft voice weaving tales of stars. Eldon's chest tightened, his breath shallow. He'd dismissed her as a cog in his machine, but she'd been the pulse of this house. Her absence was a void, and Thane's pain filled it, raw and unrelenting. Eldon clutched the rocket pieces, his hands trembling, as if holding them could undo his verdict. Thane's door creaked open upstairs, and Eldon braced himself. The boy shuffled into the kitchen, his eyes red-rimmed, the bottle-cap rocket's base still clutched in his hand. "Why'd you do it, Dad?" Thane's voice was small but sharp, cutting deeper than any boardroom rebuke. Zora didn't deserve that. Eldon opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to explain rules, discipline, the order that built his empire. But the image of Zora's father trembling under her care choked his excuses. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice low, unfamiliar. Thane's gaze hardened, a child's trust fractured. You always say mistakes are weak, but you're the wrong one. The words stung, a truth Eldon couldn't dodge. Maris entered, her presence a quiet storm. She set a plate of toast before Thane, but he pushed it away, his eyes fixed on the rocket piece. She made this for me, he whispered, tears welling. She said I could reach the stars. Now she's gone. Maris's hand froze on the counter, her jaw tight. She turned to Eldon, her voice steady but laced with fire. He's right, Eldon. You took more than a maid from him. You took his hope. Eldon's throat burned. Maris rarely challenged him, but now her words were a mirror, reflecting his arrogance. He judged Zora without question, blind to the life she carried beyond his walls. He stood, pacing the kitchen, the glass walls amplifying his restlessness. Zora's sacrifice replayed in his mind, her weary steps through Oakland's gritty streets, the pill bottle's stark label, her whispered care for her father. He'd called her careless, but she was fighting a battle he'd never known. His wealth insulated him from struggle, but Zora faced it with a strength that shamed him. He thought of her silence as she left, her head high despite his cruelty. It wasn't defiance, it was resilience, a quiet power he'd underestimated. His rules, his empire, felt hollow now, built on sand when weighed against her sacrifice. Thane slid off his chair, clutching the rocket piece, and shuffled back to his room. Eldon followed, pausing at the doorway. The boy sat on his bed, arranging science project notes scrawled in Zora's handwriting, each page a testament to her care. She believed in me, Thane said, not looking up. More than you ever did. The accusation hit like a blade, slicing through Eldon's defenses. He wanted to reach out, to promise he'd fix this, but the words felt empty. Thane's pain was his creation, a wound he'd inflicted with his rigid rules. He backed away, the room's dim light swallowing his son's small figure. Maris found him in the hallway, her eyes softer now but still searching. You saw something in Oakland, didn't you? She asked, her voice low. Eldon nodded, his gaze dropping. She's caring for her father, Maris. Sick, frail, no one else to help. She walked miles to save money for his medicine. His voice cracked, the truth heavy on his tongue. Maris's expression shifted, a mix of sorrow and resolve. Then you know she's more than you thought. But knowing isn't enough, Eldon. Thane needs her. We all do. She touched his arm, a rare gesture, and walked away, leaving him with the weight of her words. Eldon retreated to the living room, sinking into a couch that felt too large, too cold. The mansion's silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of Silicon Valley's tech pulse. He'd built a life where every variable was controlled, but Zora had upended it. Her strength, her sacrifice, exposed the fragility of his world. He thought of Thane's notes, Zora's handwriting, weaving dreams into reality. She'd given his son something he couldn't believe, warmth, a spark of possibility, and he'd repaid her with dismissal, blind to the life she fought for. Shame burned deeper now, a fire he couldn't extinguish. He stood, drawn to Thane's room again, peering through the crack in the door. The boy slept, the rocket piece tucked under his arm, his face streaked with dried tears. Eldon's heart twisted. He'd seen Zora's truth, but it only sharpened his regret. Why hadn't she spoken up? Was it pride or fear of his judgment? The questions gnawed, each one a reminder of his failure. He couldn't undo the past, but he could seek more answers. Zora's life held secrets he needed to understand, not just for Thane, but for the man he was becoming. As the mansion's lights dimmed, Eldon's resolve hardened. He would watch her again, to grasp the depth of her strength. The Silicon Valley mansion's sterile glow felt like a lie, as Eldon Warwick slipped out into the dusk. The weight of Thane's tear-streaked face, and Maris's piercing words pressing against his chest. Zora Hines's sacrifice, her weary hands feeding her frail father in that crumbling Oakland house, had cracked his world open, exposing the arrogance beneath his rules. Yet questions burned hotter than his shame. Why had she hidden her struggle? What drove her to endure in silence? Eldon's resolve to understand her, to see the woman he'd wronged, pulled him back to Oakland's gritty streets. His Tesla glided through the fading light, a sleek intruder in a world of broken pavement and flickering neon. Zora's strength haunted him, a puzzle he couldn't solve from the safety of his empire. Oakland's pulse was raw, its air thick with the scent of exhaust and damp concrete. Eldon parked near Zora's apartment, a sagging building dwarfed by the city's decay. The memory of Thane clutching Zora's bottle-cap rocket, his voice broken, "She believed in me," stabbed at Eldon's heart. He dismissed her as a failure, but her quiet care had been Thane's anchor. Now he needed to see more, to grasp the depth of her life. As night fell, Zora emerged, her thin jacket no shield against the evening chill. She carried a small bag, her steps heavy but determined, heading toward the same rundown house Eldon had seen before. His pulse quickened. He slipped out of the car, his shadow blending with the alley's darkness, driven by a mix of guilt and desperation. The streets were alive with menace, their edges sharpened by the hum of distant sirens and the clatter of a loose bottle rolling in the wind. Zora moved with purpose, her silhouette a faint outline against the glow of a flickering street lamp. Eldon followed, his polished shoes scuffing against gravel, his breath shallow. A group of figures loomed ahead, their voices low and rough, eyeing Zora as she passed. Eldon's heart lurched. Danger? He hesitated, his instinct to protect warring with his need to stay unseen. Zora's head stayed high, her pace unbroken, and the figures turned away, their laughter swallowed by the night. Eldon exhaled, his guilt twisting tighter. She navigated this world daily, while he judged her from his glass tower. Zora reached the peeling house, its windows dim. Eldon crept closer, crouching by the same crooked blinds, his chest tight with anticipation. Inside, Zora sat by her father, his frail form slouched in the wheelchair. She pulled a new pill bottle from her bag, her hands trembling as she opened it. "Papa, we're okay now," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of hope. But then a shadow moved outside, a man unsteady, his voice slurring as he banged on the door. "Zora, I know you're in there," he shouted, his words thick with liquor. Eldon stiffened, his fists clenching. Zora's face tightened, but she stood, her movements calm yet weary. She opened the door a crack, her voice firm. "Go home, Reggie. Not tonight." The man swayed, demanding money, his hand gripping the frame. Zora pushed back, her strength quiet but unyielding. "I said no," she snapped, shutting the door. Eldon's breath caught, his heart pounding. The man stumbled away, cursing, but Zora's bag slipped, a single pill bottle rolling onto the porch. She knelt in the dim light, her fingers scraping the cracked wood to retrieve it. The bottle cracked, pills scattering like stars in the dust. Zora froze, a soft gasp escaping her lips, then frantically gathered the fragments, her hands shaking. Eldon's throat burned. This was her life, every moment a fight, every cent a lifeline for her father. He'd called her careless, but she was carrying a world he'd never known. His shame surged, a tidal wave drowning his pride. He wanted to step forward, to help, but his feet were rooted, his guilt a chain. Her resilience seared him. Zora stood, clutching the broken bottle, her face etched with exhaustion but unbroken. She returned to her father, her voice steady as she reassured him. "We'll manage, Papa." Eldon's mind spun, memories of Thane's grief crashing against Zora's strength. He'd seen her as a servant, a rule breaker, but she was a warrior, fighting battles he'd never faced. His childhood flashed, his father's cold voice berating him for a mistake he couldn't explain. He'd done the same to Zora, his verdict as harsh as his father's. The realization cut deep, his hands trembling in the dark. He'd built an empire on control, but Zora's quiet courage exposed its fragility. He retreated to his car, the alley shadow swallowing him. Zora's image, kneeling, gathering those scattered pills, burned into his soul. She wasn't just Thane's confidant. She was a force. Her love for her father, a mirror to the care she'd shown his son. Eldon's heart ached, the weight of his mistake heavier than ever. Maris's words echoed, "Fix it, Eldon." But how? He'd seen Zora's truth twice now, each glimpse peeling back his arrogance. Yet he still didn't know her. why she hid her pain, why she endured alone. His empire felt hollow, its wealth useless against her strength. As Oakland's lights flickered, Eldon's resolve hardened. He needed to face her, to confront the man he'd been, but the path to that truth was still shrouded in shadow. The Oakland night clung to Eldon Warwick like a shadow. Zora Hines's image, kneeling on that cracked porch, salvaging scattered pills under a flickering street lamp, etched into his soul. Back in his Silicon Valley mansion, the glass walls seemed to close in, their sterile gleam mocking his unraveling certainty. Zora's quiet strength, her fierce resolve despite a broken pill bottle and a drunkard's threats, had shattered his world of rules. He'd seen her twice now, each glimpse peeling back his arrogance, revealing a woman who carried more than he'd ever dared. Her whispered, "Papa, we're okay," echoed in his mind, a testament to a love he'd never had to fight for. Guilt surged through him, a tide he couldn't stem, drowning the man who'd fired her without a second thought. Eldon stood in the darkened living room, the hum of Silicon Valley's tech pulse a faint murmur beyond the windows. Thane's bottle cap rocket, its pieces still scattered from that morning's chaos, lay on the dining table, a relic of Zora's care. He touched it, the jagged edges biting his fingers, each one a reminder of his son's grief. Thane's words, "She believed in me," cut deeper than ever, a blade of truth slicing through his pride. He'd built an empire on control, but Zora had built something stronger, a bond with his son, woven through late-night stories and patient hands. Eldon's throat tightened, his breath uneven. He'd called her careless, but she was carrying a world, her father's life, Thane's dreams, while he'd only carried his own ego. Maris's footsteps broke the silence, soft but deliberate. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the hallway's glow. "You're still awake," she said, her voice low, heavy with unspoken questions. Eldon turned, his eyes meeting hers, and saw the same fire that had burned when she challenged him. "I followed her again," he admitted, his voice raw, the words spilling like a confession. "She's fighting for her father, Maris. Every day, every step, for him." Maris's expression softened, but her gaze held steady. "And you judged her for it," she said, not accusing, but stating a fact, each word a weight on his conscience. "Thane's hurting because of you. We all are." Eldon's chest ached, Maris's truth landing like a blow. He thought of Thane, asleep upstairs, clutching the rocket piece, his face streaked with tears even in dreams. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought she was just late." Maris stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly. "She was never just anything, Eldon. She was Thane's light, his hope, and you snuffed it out." Her words weren't cruel, but they were unflinching, each one a mirror reflecting his failure. Eldon's mind flashed to Zora's hands, trembling as she gathered those pills, her face set with resolve despite exhaustion. He'd seen her strength, but Maris's words made it real. He'd broken something sacred, not just for Thane, but for their home. He sank onto the couch, the leather cold against his skin. The mansion's silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of servers that powered his empire. He'd always prided himself on seeing patterns, predicting outcomes, but Zora had defied his logic. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was armor, shielding a life of sacrifice he'd never understood. He thought of his own childhood, his father's cold voice berating him for mistakes, never asking why. He'd vowed to be different, but he'd become the same, judging, unyielding, blind. Zora's resilience, her love for her father, mirrored the care she'd shown Thane, and Eldon had dismissed it all with a slammed mug. Maris sat beside him, her presence a quiet anchor. "What did you see out there?" she asked, her voice softer now, probing. Eldon's hands clenched, the memory of Zora's struggle vivid. "She was unbreakable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A man threatened her, Maris, demanded money. Her medicine broke, and she still kept going, picking up the pieces for her father." His eyes burned, the weight of her courage crushing him. Maris touched his arm, a rare gesture. "She's stronger than us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thane saw that. Why couldn't you? The question hung, unanswered, a wound Eldon couldn't close. He stood pacing the room, the glass walls reflecting his restless shadow. Thane's room beckoned, and he climbed the stairs, pausing at the door. The boy slept, the bottle-cap rocket tucked under his arm, his face still marked by tears. Eldon's heart twisted. He'd seen Zora's truth, her father's frail form, her scattered pills, but it only sharpened his regret. Why hadn't she fought back, explained her lateness? Was it pride or fear of his judgment? The questions gnawed, each one a reminder of his failure. He'd built a life where every variable was controlled, but Zora's strength exposed its fragility. Thane's love for her, Maris's quiet accusations, were truths he couldn't escape. Eldon returned to the living room, his mind a storm of guilt and awe. Zora wasn't just a maid. She was a force, her sacrifices a beacon in the darkness of his rules. He thought of Thane's science projects, Zora's handwriting weaving dreams into reality. She'd given his son belief, a spark he'd never kindled, and he'd repaid her with dismissal, blind to her battle. Maris's words echoed, "Fix it, Eldon." But how? The truth he'd seen in Oakland was a weight, not a solution. Zora's life demanded more than regret. It demanded action. As the mansion's lights dimmed, Eldon's heart raced, his shame a fire he couldn't douse. He needed to face her, to understand her fully, but that step felt like crossing an abyss. The Silicon Valley mansion's cold glow felt like a prison, its glass walls reflecting Eldon Warwick's fractured soul. Zora Hines's resilience, her hands scraping up scattered pills in Oakland's grim dusk, her steady voice calming her frail father. Burned in his mind, a fire that no amount of wealth could extinguish. Maris's words, "Fix it, Eldon," echoed like a verdict, each syllable tightening the knot of shame in his chest. He'd seen Zora's truth twice, her quiet strength exposing his arrogance. But it wasn't enough. Thane's tear-streaked face, clutching her bottle-cap rocket, haunted him, a reminder of the bond he'd severed. Eldon stood in the living room, the silence suffocating, his heart pounding with a truth he couldn't outrun. He'd wronged a woman whose courage dwarfed his empire. He paced the hardwood floor, his shadow flickering against the glass, each step a battle between pride and regret. Zora's life was a tapestry of sacrifice. Miles walked to save pennies, nights spent guarding her father's fading light. He'd called her careless, but she was a warrior, her silence a shield against a world that offered no mercy. Eldon's fingers brushed the photo on the coffee table. Thane beaming beside Zora at a science fair, her arm around him. The memory stung, sharp and unrelenting. She'd given his son dreams, weaving constellations into his world, while Eldon had only given rules. His throat tightened, the weight of his failure pressing down like a stone. He judged her without question, blind to the heart that held his family together. Thane's voice broke the silence, small and raw from the staircase. "Dad, do you even care?" Eldon turned, his breath catching. The boy stood there, clutching the rocket piece, his eyes red but fierce. "Zora cared. She listened to me. You just broke everything." The words were a blade slicing through Eldon's defenses. He wanted to reach out, to promise he'd make it right, but Thane's gaze held no trust, only hurt. "She said I could be an astronaut," Thane whispered, his voice cracking. "Now she's gone, and you don't even feel bad." Eldon's heart twisted, his hands trembling. He wanted to argue. He did feel bad, more than Thane could know. But the boy's pain was his creation, a wound he'd carved with his own hands. Maris appeared behind Thane, her presence a quiet storm. She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him back to his room, but her eyes locked on Eldon's, sharp with expectation. "He's right," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "You broke something, Eldon, not just for Thane, but for all of us." She paused, her gaze softening, but only slightly. "You've seen her truth. What are you going to do about it?" The question hung, heavy as lead, and Maris's footsteps faded up the stairs, leaving Eldon alone with its weight. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, Zora's image flooding his mind, her hands gathering those broken pills, her voice steady despite exhaustion. His childhood surged up, unbidden, a memory of his father's cold voice, berating him for a forgotten chore, never asking why. Eldon had been late once, helping a neighbor fix a broken fence, but his father hadn't cared for explanations. He'd vowed to be different, to build a life of fairness, but he'd become the same, unyielding, blind. Zora's silence wasn't weakness. It was strength, a refusal to beg for understanding from a man who'd already judged her. Eldon's chest ached, the realization cutting deeper than any boardroom loss. He'd dismissed her as a servant, but she was the heart of his home, the light in Thane's eyes. His rules had failed him, and now his family was paying the price. He stood, drawn to Thane's room, peering through the cracked door. The boy slept, the bottle-cap rocket tucked under his arm, his face still marked by tears. Eldon's heart clenched. Thane's love for Zora wasn't childish. It was fierce, a bond forged in moments Eldon had never bothered to notice. He thought of Zora's handwriting on Thane's science projects, her stories of stars that calmed his fears. She'd given his son something he couldn't believe, warmth, a spark of possibility. And he'd repaid her with a slammed mug and a cold dismissal. The shame was a fire now, burning through his pride, leaving only regret in its wake. Maris's voice echoed in his mind. "What are you going to do about it?" Eldon paced again, the mansion's silence a weight he couldn't shake. He'd seen Zora's struggle, her father's frail form, her fight against a drunkard's threats, but it wasn't enough to know her pain. He needed to face her, to look into the eyes he'd dismissed and see the woman who'd reshaped his world. The thought terrified him, a vulnerability he'd never allowed. His empire was built on control, but Zora's strength demanded something else, humility, a step into the unknown. He stopped, his gaze falling on the photo again, Zora's smile a beacon in the dark. The night pressed against the glass walls, Silicon Valley's lights flickering like distant stars. Eldon's resolve hardened, but it was fragile, laced with fear. He couldn't undo the firing, but he could seek her out, not as a billionaire, but as a man stripped bare by truth. Zora's life was a lesson he hadn't finished learning, her courage a mirror to his failures. Thane's pain, Maris's challenge, pushed him toward a choice he wasn't ready to make. He needed to see her again, not in shadows but face to face to confront the man he'd been. The path ahead was uncertain, a leap from the safety of his rules into a world where Zora's strength reigned. As the mansion's hum faded, Eldon's heart raced, his shame a beacon guiding him toward redemption. The Silicon Valley mansion's sterile silence was a weight on Eldon Warwick's shoulders. Maris's challenge, "What are you going to do about it?" A fire in his veins. Zora Hines' strength, her hands salvaging scattered pills in Oakland's grim dusk, had stripped him bare, exposing a man who'd built an empire on rules but failed his family. Thane's tear-streaked accusation, "You don't even feel bad," echoed in his heart, a wound he'd carved with his own arrogance. Eldon stood at the edge of his living room, the glass walls reflecting a man he barely recognized, one humbled by a woman he'd dismissed. Zora's quiet courage demanded more than regret. It demanded action. His resolve, fragile but unyielding, propelled him into the night, back to Oakland, to face the woman whose truth had shattered his world. The city's pulse was raw, its streets a maze of shadows and flickering neon. Eldon's Tesla glided to Zora's sagging apartment building, its peeling paint a stark contrast to his mansion's gleam. His heart pounded, each beat a mix of fear and determination. He'd seen her sacrifice, her father's frail form, her fight against a drunkard's threats, but facing her now felt like stepping into an abyss. His rules, his wealth were useless here. He climbed the creaking stairs, his polished shoes out of place on the worn steps, and knocked on her door, the sound sharp in the quiet. The wait was agonizing, each second stretching his shame into a chasm. Zora opened the door, her eyes widening, weary but proud. She clutched a cracked pill bottle, the same one she'd salvaged, its jagged edges a testament to her fight. "Mr. Warwick," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "Why are you here?" Eldon's throat tightened, his usual confidence gone. Her presence, unyielding despite her exhaustion, was a mirror to his failure. "Zora, I saw you," he said, his voice raw. breaking. I followed you twice. I saw your father, your struggle. I saw you pick up those pills in the dark. Her gaze hardened, but she didn't speak, her silence a wall he'd built with his judgment. I was wrong, Eldon continued, his words spilling like a confession. I called you careless, but you're stronger than I'll ever be. I fired you without asking, without caring. I'm sorry. His voice cracked, the weight of his shame bearing his soul. Zora's eyes softened, but she shook her head, her voice low. It's my burden, Mr. Warwick, not yours. The words stung, her humility cutting deeper than any rebuke. Eldon stepped closer, his hands trembling. It's ours now, he said, his tone firm but pleading. You gave Thane more than I ever did. Love, belief. You're not just a maid, you're family. Zora's breath hitched, her hand tightening on the pill bottle. I don't need pity, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. Eldon shook his head, his eyes burning. It's not pity, it's respect. Thane needs you. We all do. Come back, not to work, but to belong. I'll cover your father's medicine, get you a car, anything you need. Zora's eyes glistened, tears tracing her cheeks, but she stood tall, her dignity unbroken. Why now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I was blind, Eldon said, his own tears falling. You showed me what matters. The air between them was heavy, charged with truths too long unspoken. Zora looked down at the pill bottle, her fingers tracing its cracks, then back at Eldon. I never wanted to fail you, she said, her voice soft but strong. I just couldn't fail him. Eldon's heart clenched, the image of her father vivid in his mind. He judged her silence as weakness, but it was a sacrifice, a love fiercer than his rules. Say you'll come back, he urged, his voice breaking. Zora hesitated, then nodded, tears streaming. Yes, she whispered, the word a bridge between their worlds. The next morning, Zora stepped into the mansion, her steps tentative but resolute. Thane sprinted from the dining room, the bottle cap rocket in his hands, his face alight with joy. Zora, he shouted, throwing his arms around her. You're back. Zora knelt, hugging him tightly, her tears mixing with his. I'm here, Thane, she said, her voice steady now. I promise. Maris stood nearby, her eyes soft with relief, a rare smile breaking through. Welcome home, she said, her voice warm, embracing Zora like a sister. Eldon watched, his chest tight with a new emotion, hope. He'd arranged a caregiver for Zora's father, a car for her commute, but it was her presence that filled the mansion's void. The glass walls no longer felt like a cage. Eldon's empire, built on control, had crumbled under Zora's strength, and he was rebuilding it with something new, compassion. Thane's laughter, Zora's quiet smile, reshaped the house into a home. Maris touched Eldon's arm, her voice low. You did the right thing. Eldon nodded, his throat thick. I was blind, he said, his eyes on Zora and Thane. She showed me how to see. Zora's courage, her love, had changed him, a lesson carved into his soul. He'd never judge by rules alone again, knowing now that every struggle hid a story deeper than his wealth could measure. Zora's courage had reshaped their world, a lesson in love that lingered. What did her strength teach you? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear them. Thank you for joining this journey through sacrifice and redemption. Come back soon for another story that stirs the heart.